Okay, I'm just going to stop sharing for a second. I'd like to read a land acknowledgement, and these are coming quite common, which is good, but sometimes what happens is that the intent and the meaning of the acknowledgement kind of just gets doesn't get appreciated for what it's worth. And so I'm asking that everybody just listens to the words and considers the true intent of the land acknowledgement. So we would like to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have had and continue to have presence and deep connection with the lands on and near the Oak Ridges Moraine, a part of what is known to the Indigenous peoples of North America as Turtle Island. These lands are the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewas of Georgina Island and Rama and Beausoleil, and the Mississaugas of Alderville, Curve Lake, Hiawatha, and Scugog Island. And these are the First Nations of the Williams Treaties. We'd like to thank them and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land with us. Indigenous people have been subjected to colonial oppression and injustice, which continues to this day, sadly. The Oak Ridges Moraine Land Trust would like to acknowledge, and they do acknowledge, that the first step to reconciliation is recognizing Indigenous people and their inherent rights to this land, which will ensure that we are creating a better future by strengthening our relationship with them and the land. Our land trust endeavors to honor the land and its treaties by ensuring a healthy ecosystem that thrives forever. We recognize that working together with Indigenous people to include ecological traditional knowledge systems moves us towards an equitable and sustainable future. So thank you for listening to that, and thank you to the Indigenous people of the area for sharing with us this land. Okay. Great. So how many people in the audience know what a land trust does? And I ask this question for all our webinars and in person, and I usually maybe get one person, but I get people like dust bunnies go by or dust balls. So land trusts do great things, and admittedly, I've been in the industry as a biologist for over 20 years now, and I wasn't really sure what they did until I started working for one. So it's completely understandable if you don't know what a land trust does, but I'm going to tell you because it's pretty cool, which is why I'm still here working for them. So we are a registered charity in Canada, and we provide permanent protection of ecologically sensitive and important lands. We also protect farmlands. About 50% of our protected land is farmland, because farmland is important too, both ecologically and also for us for sustenance and food security. And we do this through easement donations, and those are conservation easements, so they go on the land, and the person can sell the land and pass it on or whatever, and the protection stays with it. We do it through donations of land and also through purchases of land. It is mandated protection, so we do it through the Ecological Gift Program, which I'll talk about, and that is basically a federal level protection, and it's a really hard thing to break. So we say that we are protection beyond legislation, and if you are from Ontario, you might have seen some of the changes to the protections in recent times of what we thought was protected areas are now starting to be open up for development. So the way we approach it, we can overcome that, which is great. So we've just bumped up our new properties. We've added another 195.6 acres of land. So that brings our total of protected land across the Moraine to 5,269 acres, and that's on 67 properties. And this provides resiliency against climate change and some of the impacts from that. It provides species at risk habitat. And it helps protect our biological, environmental, and even cultural heritage. Why do we do it? We want healthy ecosystems. It's pretty neat to be standing on one of our properties and knowing that the forest we're at will one day be an old growth. And we don't have to worry about it becoming a Subway or a chain store or a subdivision or a parking lot. That's a pretty awesome feeling. So we want people, generations down the road to be able to appreciate the nature that we have today. It provides protection for our species at risk and their habitat. And it's as I mentioned, it provides nature and all the benefits associated with that for the future generations. So here's a map that just shows how dispersed our protected properties are. And most of them are conservation easement agreements, because if you've tried to buy a property recently, the prices are very expensive to buy. So an easement is a cost-effective way, and it also provides flexibility for the owners to protect their land. So there we are. And this is our newest, and this is the first announcement. 195 acres in Northumberland were protected. It will be restored as to rare pine oak savanna habitat. And this provides habitat for quite a diversity of species at risk, because it's such a rare habitat that losing it means we've lost a lot of the species. And our superstar bird, the Kirtland's warbler, which is the bird of fire, and it is North America's rarest songbird, and it is endangered in Ontario and Canada. It's just recently been delisted as endangered down in the US after 40 or 50 years of restoration, because it was almost, I think there was only 500 individuals at one point, which isn't enough. So we had our first, last year we had 6 males show up on territory just north of the Moraine in Simcoe, and that's great news. So if you build it, they will come. So we protected land, and now we're going to start building it, and they'll come, hopefully. If not, I'm sure something else will, because it's great habitat. So this is the initiative we're working on. If you're interested, we will be having volunteer opportunities, maybe not quite right now, but we will be having a lot of volunteer opportunities. If you're interested, you can send me an email, or you can go on to our website and go under Explore, and you'll see Kirtland's warbler, and there's information on there and links to sign up specifically to either support or volunteer for that project. Very cool. All right, we've got tonight's amazing webinar, and I'm so excited about it. And I have so many pictures of moss and lichen, because I just find it fascinating. But we've got some other great ones coming up this month. It's March Madness, but that's copyrighted, so it's just March fun for us. We have a really neat one, the bird names in Anishinaabe-Mowin, and that's with the Crater Gardens, and it's Indigenous and birds experts from Bird Studies Canada, I think it is. And they're talking about the Indigenous names for birds and what they mean, and then how that relates to the science that we know. So it's going to be a really fascinating webinar. And then we have the Meet the Kirtland Warbler coming up. And then we have the Pollinator Palooza, and that is with Lorraine Johnson, who's written a lot of amazing books. And that's about bees and pollinators and how to support them. So you can go and find them out, what we have, and more information at oakridgesmoraine.org/events, and you can register there. So, of course, I've got Cassandra's up here, and the notes I can't see. So I'm going to do a really bad job at your bio. Cassandra is one of the few people that knows a lot about those little amazing things out there. So bryophytes, mosses, lichens, all that amazing thing that makes up that incredible diversity on the forest floor, and it's an integral part of that forest. She's worked with the Museum of Nature, and she's now working with M&R, but she's here on her own. It's personal, so she's not representing M&R. She just loves them so much that she likes to do this on her spare time, and I do the same thing. I do my work after hours because I just love what I do. So Cassandra, if I've missed something important, which I'm sure I have because I can't see the notes, I will turn it over to you. But I just would like to say thank you very much for coming tonight, and I'm very much looking forward to your talk. So thank you very much. And I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I will share my screen. Okay. Can everybody see? Is it showing up correctly?
Yes, it is.
Perfect.
Right. Hopefully everyone else.
Yeah. Okay. I'm getting lots of thumbs up. Excellent.
Okay, good.
Alrighty then. Okay. Thanks so much. And yeah, I have a little chunk where I can introduce myself more if need be. So first of all, thank you so much to everybody for being here, because if you're here, it's because you're curious to hear more about bryophytes, and that is like a relatively rare thing. You're among the few who are have noticed them and have are curious to learn more. So thank you so much for being here. It's awesome to have some enthusiasm. And I am going to see if I can get my own screen smaller so that I am not in my own way. There we go. Perfect. Okay. All right. So I'm going to just give this talk is mostly a general overview. So a closer look at bryophytes, the little big world of mosses, liverworts, and hornworts in Ontario. This is a fairly general talk just to introduce everyone to what bryophytes are, give an overview of their biology, their ecology, and also talk a little bit about how bryophytes function in ecosystems, introduce a couple of the most common neighbors that you might find in your area, and also give a little introduction to how people might be able to get more into looking for bryophytes and getting more curious and learning more about how they can get started looking at them and getting to know them better. So with that in mind, and I hope my pacing is going to be okay. There might be some things where it might be some times where I brush over something a little bit too quickly. There's probably a huge diversity of people in the audience with all sorts of different backgrounds. So if I go past something a little too fast and you have a lot of questions about it, please ask questions at the end, or put them in the chat while the presentation is going, and then we can field them at the end, because there is absolutely no such thing as a silly question. I'm happy to answer any and all questions. And so with that, I will get into it. So first, I'll just introduce myself a little bit. I'm a botanist with a background in conservation planning, as well as natural history, collection and data management. I've been looking at bryophytes for about 12 years now. Wow, time flies. Through various capacities, and thanks in large part to my mentor, Jennifer Doubt, who is the curator at the National Herbarium of Canada. And I just want to acknowledge her contributions to this presentation on this slide, because this presentation is one that is adapted from a presentation that we've co-produced in the past and co-presented. And so a lot of different parts of this presentation are from her and used with her permission. And so I just wanted to acknowledge her contributions to this presentation, and for, showing me the ropes and being an amazing supportive mentor to keep me interested and engaged and to keep me learning for 12 years. So yeah. And also I apologize, my cat has decided it is Zoom time. It is a crazy time. So if you hear background noise, that's what that is. So first of all, you might be asking yourself what a bryophyte is, but first I just wanted to introduce what bryophytes aren't, because I just kind of want to get that out of the way first things first, to help frame what we're looking at. So bryophytes are not, these are a couple examples of things that tend to get either called moss in various capacities, or they're tiny and so they often get confused with moss. So bryophytes are not lichens, for example. Lichens are a symbiosis between fungus and an algae, where they grow so intertwined together that they are their own unique dual organism. They are not red algae or any kind of seaweed. That is sometimes confused for mosses. So for example, something called Irish moss, which is dulse, is actually a red algae. And so that's just something to keep in mind. Also, and again, similarly with lichens, sometimes reindeer lichen is called reindeer moss. And you might, if you're in a craft store, see something called craft moss, which looks very, very similar to the thing in this picture here. And those are actually lichens. This is a star-tipped reindeer lichen. And there are some very tiny vascular plants that are sometimes confused with mosses. For example, down here in this corner is something that is called a spike moss, but it is not actually a moss. It is a very tiny vascular plant. There's also things, this is, oh goodness, I've forgotten the name for it, Sagina, that is, again, a really, really tiny vascular plant, but you can see it has flowers, and mosses do not have flowers, as I will talk about shortly. So that's just an idea. This is what these are some things that are often mistaken for bryophytes. Bryophytes are, in fact, non-vascular plants. So I'd say any terrestrial non-vascular plants. So that includes the mosses, the liverworts, which are both leafy or thalloid. So these are leafy ones up here, and these are thalloid ones down here, and hornworts. And I'll give a little bit more context on what each of those are. This presentation focuses a lot on mosses, just because they tend to be the most showy, the most diverse, and sometimes the largest, and therefore easier to see, easier to photograph. And so there's a little bit more of a bias in most bryophyte discussion towards mosses. But in Ontario, we also have liverworts of both kinds, and we have hornworts. I'm not going to talk a lot about hornworts because Ontario only has about 4 species, and they are quite rare and hard to hard to see in a predictable way. So they're sometimes, so I don't have a lot of photos of them, is what I'm trying to say. All right. And now when I say non-vascular plants, I'm talking about, so things like wildflowers, trees. These are the things that we tend to see that are a little bit bigger, more showy. And what we learn in sort of an introduction to plants in, say, high school, we know that, plants have roots and stems and leaves, and the roots suck water up from the ground and they transport it up the stem and bring it to the leaves, and the leaves create sugar, and then the stem transports the sugars down to from the leaves down the stem into the roots. Bryophytes don't have that kind of complex circulatory system. So they don't have xylem and phloem, the water and sugar transportation system, and they don't have proper roots. So here's an example of a cross-section of a cedar, a young cedar stem, and you see it's got this very complex sort of specialization of different tissues. And this is a bryophyte cross-section here. This is a stem of a bryophyte, and you can see it really doesn't have that kind of specialization at all. It's just sort of undifferentiated cells. And so this is what we're talking about when we say they're non-vascular. They don't have any active transportation of water or sugar. It's just capillary action, like a sponge. They suck up water the way a sponge sucks up water. Which means that they have to, in order to absorb water, they absorb it through all parts of the plant, like a sponge. So think of a sponge when you're thinking about how they operate. The water diffuses into individual cells and crosses between cells, between cell walls, the same way that the cells of a sponge suck up water. And so this is, when you think about this, so that means that they have to be in direct contact with the water that they're absorbing in order to have that water in their cells. And so you can see how it would be a challenge to grow very tall if you need to have water, always be in close contact with water. By the time you start growing super tall, the top of the plant is so far away from any kind of standing water that it's not going to suck up that water to get to the top of the plant. So this is why bryophytes are quite so small. The other sort of consequence of this mechanic is that bryophytes are also very, very prone to drying out. So as soon as there's no water around, they dry out quite quickly. The evaporation happens at all parts of their body, but that means that they can be, especially in mosses and bryophytes that grow in areas that dry out frequently, they can be very highly adapted to drying out and still surviving. And that's a superpower that they have that I'll get into a little bit later. So you can see when I'm saying small, I'm talking bryophytes are very, very small. You can see these are photos of bryophyte moss leaves. And these are some larger species of moss. And they're still only a couple of millimeters long, these leaves. So you can imagine, excuse me, if you're looking at, it's not looking at a bryophyte in order to learn more about it and see what characters it has in order to differentiate between them. It's not quite as easy as looking at a tree with your tree guide and trying to compare leaves and bark, and I'll get into that a little bit more as well. So magnification is really important when looking at them, but yeah, they're very, very small. There are about 680 species of bryophyte in Ontario, that includes mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. So they're for some people that's quite an eye opener, and I guess that's kind of the point of this talk, is to get people to be thinking more about how diverse they are. I apologize, my throat is super tickly all of a sudden. So you can see that from these photos that bryophytes grow in a huge diversity of forms. And these actually, what I'm showing on this slide is only mosses. So just mosses alone have a hugely diverse morphology. And then liverworts and hornworts, again, have even more variations. But in general, I'm going to give you an overview of the sort of general morphology of a bryophyte. And again, the examples are going to be mostly mosses, just for illustrative purposes. But anything I say about bryophytes will apply, even if the mosses are the main examples. This applies pretty much to all groups of bryophytes. So there's sort of a basic morphology of bryophytes. Starting from the bottom, we have the rhizoids. These are not true roots. Excuse me. These are not true roots. They they help the bryophyte plant attach to whatever substrate is growing on, but that's all it does. It doesn't have any kind of active transportation of water from a substrate up to the plant. It's simply purely functional, and it operates, the cells of it are not much more differentiated than any other cell in the bryophyte. And then you have leaves. These leaves aren't true leaves. They don't have those layers of air pockets and chlorophyllous layers. These are all just sort of undifferentiated photosynthetic cells, and just like with other plants, they do perform photosynthesis, so they make the food for the plant. And this is also the part of the plant, the stem and the leaf. The vegetative part of the bryophyte is where the sexual reproduction happens. Once sexual reproduction occurs, you have this long, in many cases, in many species, this long stalk with a capsule on top. The stalk simply just holds up the capsule far away from the plant, holds it up into the air, and the capsule disperses the spores. So bryophytes disperse by spores, kind of like ferns do. And so I just wanted to give you an example. So there's the general morphology, and I just want to show how that applies to the different groups. So for mosses, this is a very good example of that image that you just saw, where you have the vegetative portion of the moss, and then the stalk, and then a capsule on the end. For liverworts, they look a little bit different. They have this sort of white translucent stalk, and then the capsule, a little ball on the end. And then for hornworts are really cool. They have this vegetative part, or these like lobe looking bits at the bottom. It's kind of like this thyroid liverwort, except that when it comes time to disperse spores, they shoot up these long horns, and these horns actually split down the middle when it's time to disperse the spores. And so the spores are actually inside the horn, and the horn will split in order to spread. Okay, so mosses have two different kinds of reproduction that I'm going to go over. One is sort of sexual reproduction, much the same way as, as flowers do, as other vascular plants that you might be familiar with, where they have ovaries and also anthers, in this case antheridia. But they're just a lot more subtle and tiny and discreet than in flowers. So here you have down here in the ovaries of a moss, and they're embedded in the vegetative part of the plant. And this is an example of a small plant that has ovaries developing in it. And here's a picture of a male plant with a bunch of antheridia nested inside. Often they're at the tip of the plant, but not always. And this is an example of one antheridium. And that disperses sperm, and then the ovaries have the eggs. So sexual reproduction in mosses and other bryophytes, it doesn't happen through, say, pollen in flowers. It actually happens by swimming sperm. So the vegetative part of the plant will actually create, so these are the male plants, and sometimes the male parts are on the same plants as the female parts, and sometimes they're on separate plants. And so you can see these are all the antheridia producing sperm, and then so when it gets wet, when it rains, bryophytes actually rely on water, not just to be awake and functioning and photosynthesizing, but also to reproduce sexually, because that's the only way the sperm actually have to swim to the female plants in order to fertilize them. And then after fertilization, this is where once a piece of the reproductive plant, so the female part would have been here, and once fertilization occurs, there is a stalk that grows up, and then the dispersal happens via spores that are inside the capsule. And I'm just going to show a couple of examples of what capsules look like in mosses, just to give you an idea of what's going on there. So a young capsule on a moss will have this sort of hood over top. And once that hood comes off, there might be like a little cap on top that seals the spores in, but when it's ready to disperse, that cap will fall off. And this is what's inside underneath that cap. You see these really gorgeous and sometimes very elaborate, what we call teeth. These are the peristome teeth of a moss capsule. And the spores are inside the capsule. You can see these green bits here, all held in by these peristome teeth. And how this works is, so most mosses, like most bryophytes, disperse their spores by wind or air currents, if they do that at all. And so ideally, it wouldn't be very good for them if they did that when it was, say, raining, because then all the spores would just fall straight to the ground. So what they do is once the conditions are right, once it's dry and air currents are sort of more favorable to disperse the spores, the peristome teeth are actually designed to open up when they're dry and then close when they're wet. And so once they're dry, these teeth will start to open up and they'll release the spores. That is one way that it happens. In some species where they actually disperse by water, the peristome teeth are designed to open when they're wet and then close when they're dry. Another way that a small group of species of moss will disperse, there is one case of animal-assisted dispersal of spores. There is a group of mosses, the Splachnaceae or dung mosses, that are actually evolved to recruit flies, attract flies, so that the flies can disperse spores to dung, because that's where they grow. And I could do a whole other talk just on that, and have. So if you have any questions about that, let me know. So that's sexual reproduction, but bryophytes have this other superpower called totipotency, which means that any vegetative cell can grow, has the potential, if the conditions are right, to grow into a new fully grown, fully reproductive organism. And here's a kind of an interesting example that I had seen of a broom moss colony that had been kicked around by an animal. And so a bunch of individual shoots kind of fell off the main colony and dried up and died. But the cells were still there, and the vegetative material was still there. And so once conditions became right again, individual little pieces of this one shoot started growing back into a new moss, and eventually this would become a new colony. And so this can be a really effective tool for a lot of reasons, but one thing that bryophytes do is actually use this power to create create parts of the plant that are actually meant to fall off. So you see these sort of brittle sticks with all these little bits. These are actually called brood bodies or brood branchlets, and they're designed to be taken off the plant. And one way that this happens is by, let's say a chipmunk runs back and forth on a log on a regular basis. That chipmunk will run across the log that has this moss growing on it, break off these individual bits, and run to wherever it's going. And by doing so, disperses moss to a new, potentially suitable habitat. So hearing that, hopefully you're getting the sense that these things can grow pretty much anywhere, as long, with the caveat, they'll grow pretty much anywhere that there is at any point in time enough moisture to grow. It doesn't have to be there all the time, but as long as there's moisture collecting in a spot some of the time, they tend to be pretty happy. It depends on the species, of course, but so in case you're thinking that, you know, moss is maybe only found in these sort of rich, damp forests with lots of atmospheric moisture, they certainly like that, and that's certainly where you'll find a lot of them. You'll find way more biomass of them, but they're just as likely. Some species are just as likely to grow in the cracks of a sidewalk, because that's also a great place for water to collect. And as I mentioned before, this photo in the middle here is actually a caribou dropping in the middle of the tundra. So this is an example of one of those mosses that specifically grows on dung and recruits flies to grow on dung. So that's a little introduction to the biology of bryophytes and a little bit about their ecology. So now I'm just going to go give a little brief overview of the kind of services that bryophytes can provide in our ecosystems, and by extension, how they make our lives easier. So I'll start with the easy ones. Bryophytes are plants. And so just like any other plant, they're great for providing oxygen, controlling CO2, filtering water, especially bryophytes, because like I said, anytime that you're trying to think about what they do, just think of them like a sponge, and that's a pretty good way to sort of wrap your head around some of the things that they do for the environment. They are nature's sponge, so they are great for water filtration and erosion control, especially, you know, water running on a surface that's covered in moss is a lot more likely to not end up further downstream than on, say, a slick surface. There are some animals who are specifically designed to feed on bryophytes. The vegetative parts are not edible by most animals, but some animals do. And the capsules are actually really high. The spores are really high in protein, and so the capsules are sometimes eaten by invertebrates and small rodents. And they're great for shelter, which might surprise people, but when you think about, not all animals are, so big that they need a tree to be sheltered. So in terms of microorganisms, they're extremely critical for shelter. And I'll get into that a little bit in this next slide. Going back to that first superpower I mentioned that bryophytes have, that they can be very tolerant to drying out, and they don't need soil. They don't need like a layer of soil to dig their roots in so that they can stay damp and survive. They could grow on pretty much anything that has any kind of superficial moisture, or even just moisture in the air. Moisture in the air is enough for them to be happy. They don't need a volume of damp earth to have their roots in, which means that they could grow on a rock and all sorts of other places that vascular plants would not be able to grow. And this is one of the reasons, this is kind of the thing that why it's sort of suspected these are some of the earliest plants to have evolved on land, is this capacity to be able to colonize areas that don't have a thick soil layer. They can colonize bare rock and over time create a habitat that is suitable then for other things that might need a little bit more of a soil layer. So in that respect, they are pioneer species. They create habitat that is then suitable for other things. And so, for example, there are a lot of conifer species that actually require a layer of moss in the forest floor in order to germinate. There is also research that shows that certain kinds of leafy liverwort are critical habitat or critical shelter for a couple of things, including a species of endangered lichen. The spores actually are supposedly develop much better in and among colonies of certain leafy liverworts, because the colony itself creates the conditions that are that the lichen is happy in. And if you like water bears, mosses are tardigrade paradise. They absolutely love being in moss. Yes, water bears can survive anywhere, but they really only thrive in bryophytes. So that's my little counter argument. And so yeah, they can be really important just to create habitat for other organisms. And that includes, in some cases, they can create quite large habitats, like for example, peatlands. So if you're in a bog or a fen, or what we would call peatlands, that is actually that is thanks to what we call peat mosses. That is the mosses in the genus Sphagnum, which are sort of a distinct group in and of themselves. They hold a ton of water relative to their plant mass, and they love standing water. And what they do then is actually they love to grow in standing water with not a lot of inflow or outflow. And what they do is they grow over time. They grow longer and longer and longer as they sit in the standing water. And over time, as the colony develops, you'll get this biomass accumulating underneath the colony, even as the colony continues to grow. And what that creates is this layer of this floating mat of moss that then is stable enough to support other plants. And then the plants grow and then they die and they create even more turf, to the point where you get land forming over top of water. And this is how peatlands are formed. And this is primarily thanks to these sphagnum mosses. So if you love peatlands, thank peat moss. And if you love whiskey, thank peat moss, because that's when you're thinking of a peated Scotch, it's the burning of peat, and which is primarily made of mosses and the other botanicals that grow in peatlands. Yeah, see, I thought so. Got some Scotch lovers there. And then another thing that they're, again, building on this nature's sponges kind of theme. There are bryophytes that will grow on trees and in forest canopies. And again, so you're thinking of a forest, let's say it's covered in moss, and it rains, and all the moss on the tree absorbs a lot of the rain water and holds it in there. And then when the rain stops and the air in the forest starts to dry out, that water is still held in that moss biomass, and over time it gets released as it evaporates. And so bryophytes that grow on trees, so plants that grow on plants, we call those epiphytes. So these plants growing on plants, these mosses that are growing on trees, are thought to be really important to regulating the moisture gradients and the moisture regimes in forest canopies that have a high bryophyte mass. And so that's another really important aspect. And when you have a high enough volume of them in a forest, that can make a really substantial difference, especially in places like montane tropical cloud forests. One other thing that bryophytes do is create help with nitrogen fixation in the boreal forest. Now, this is a big deal because the boreal forest is not a particularly nitrogen-rich ecosystem. It tends to be overall very nutrient poor. Nitrogen is, of course, essential for the growth of plants, and so nitrogen fixation is critical there. And the main actor that is thought to perform nitrogen fixation in that ecosystem is lichens working in tandem with mosses. So a huge part of the boreal biomass are these big expanses of lush feather moss coating the forest floor, as well as these peltidra lichens and other cyanolichens that tend to only grow in association with feather moss mats. And these lichens have these little dark nodules on them. These are called cephalodia, I think I'm saying that correctly. And this is where these are nodules where nitrogen fixation happens. So these are the nitrogen fixers of the boreal, and they tend to really only thrive where there's a really nice feather moss layer. So it's thought that that's a critical part of the nitrogen fixation in the boreal forest. So now that I've given you an overview of what bryophytes can do in the ecosystem, hopefully I've got you a little bit interested in, maybe I need to give these a closer look. So I just thought I'd do a really quick sort of flash tour. It's certainly not going to be an identification course, but I just want to go do a whirlwind tour of a couple of the really common bryophyte species that you might expect to find in places that are really accessible to the average person, and just to show you who your neighbors might be when you start looking a little bit more closely. Who are the kinds of faces you're going to see. And so this is going to be very fast, but I'll start with the most accessible kind of habitat type, and that would be sidewalks. So even before you've managed to get to your local park, even before you've made it to your lawn, if you've just stepped out your front door and gotten to your stairs, you have a chance to see a familiar face. So these are some species that grow on sort of sidewalks and steps and stone or disturbed soil or a pathway. So there's silvery bryum, which has a nice silver tips on the edge of the shoots, which is where it gets its name from. And fire moss, which doesn't look like much when it's not creating capsules, but when it does create capsules, you notice them because it creates them all at once, and they're deep red to deep purple. So they really stand out. There's also bonfire moss, not to be confused with fire moss. I know it's very confusing, which has these gorgeous sort of swan neck curled capsules, and it does get it. Bonfire moss gets its name from the fact that it will grow on sort of used, old, long past used bonfires, but it will also grow on pavement. I had a nice colony of it growing on a pedestrian overpass at my old place. And this is one, I just wanted to include an example of a thalloid liverwort. This is a thalloid liverwort called snakewort. It's very, and it gets that name, of course, because it has this snake skin-like scaly appearance. This is one of the biggest thalloid liverworts that we have in Ontario, sort of big and showy and noticeable, and it tends to be the one that gets commonly noticed. So I just wanted to point that one out. It'll tend to grow on sort of soil banks or the edge of a path, not necessarily on concrete. It won't usually grow like straight on concrete, but it'll usually be on some dirt next to a bike path or something like that. If you're getting out to your lawn, let's say you've made it to your lawn. Like this is the joke that, you know, people who look at bryophytes are lucky if they get past the parking lot. But if you've made it to your lawn, then you might see the thyme mosses. Now, unfortunately, there are several different species that can look very similar. So I'm just going to talk about them as a group of species, the thyme mosses, and they're very nice and showy. Or you might see Lindbergh's hypnum, or there are a couple other hypnum species that you might find in lawns as well. And these guys are differentiated by these nice hook-shaped leaves. Or you might see fern moss, and unfortunately, again, there's a couple of species that look very, very, very similar within that group. So telling them apart is very difficult. But you can tell that group by this gorgeous lacy appearance from the branches being so finely divided. Now, let's say you actually do get to a park or a forest near you. These are the three most common species that you might find, especially in a conifer forest where you have a really vast, like a big mat of sort of voluptuous bryophyte, voluptuous bryophyte layer. So the first one is electrified cat's tail moss, which is also called roughneck goose moss on iNaturalist. I much prefer electrified cat's tail moss as a common name because it really does look like it got zapped. All its leaves are standing on end. And then you have stair step moss, which comes by its name honestly. It has individual steps for each season of growth. So that's that one, stair step moss, and that's very, very common in sort of boreal or conifer woods. And then red stem feather moss, which gets its name from its red stem. It's not the only moss that has a red stem, but it's a nice, sometimes it's helpful to remember it when you're stumped and confused and looking at a couple other things. So, and then one nice thing about looking at bryophytes is you don't necessarily need to wait for the snow to disappear before looking at them, because some of them will grow on trees, and those that grow on trees will be there any time of year. So if you ever wanted to go out, if you wanted to start getting out and looking closer right now, you could do that by looking at these species. So these are some really common ones. So there's New York scalewort, which is a leafy liverwort. And so you can tell this one because it tends to be this deep black purple color, which is really gorgeous. And sometimes it'll have this sort of fractal snowflake appearance. And stalking moss, again, this is a group of species that are hard to tell apart without a microscope, but you can tell them by these really gorgeous little curls. And these species will grow, both of these will grow generally at about, head height, shoulder height on a tree. So they're easy to see. You don't have to bend down to look at them. And also 2 other species that are like that is I have shingle moss and wall scalewort. The wall scalewort is actually a leafy liverwort, even though it's big and bushy like a moss. And I wanted to mention this one here. This is called poodle moss, and you find it on tree bases. It's one that's fairly common, especially towards the south. So I just wanted to mention it here. And it's called poodle moss because of its excellent little curled shoots to give it that very like shaggy poodle fur appearance. I think, oh, I can't remember what it's called, something else on INAT. Again, another example of sort of not fully satisfactory common name. I'm sort of cherry picking my favorites here. And I just wanted, this is sort of a indulgence for me that if you really love to hurt your eyes and you really can't get enough of your hand, and you have a hand lens and you want to make you want to like test its limits, and you're just thinking, wow, the smaller the better. I highly recommend finding yourself a nice, smooth, damp, rotten log with no bark left on it. You know, it's just the bark's come off and it's just this like damp rot. And then start looking really closely at those logs, because that's where you'll start to see the teeniest, tiniest of leafy liverworts. There's a couple groups that are just absolutely gorgeous. Noelia is my favorite, this rustwort, because it's a nice violet color. And it's one of those ones where it doesn't look like much with the naked eye, and even under a hand lens, like this photo is actually taken with a hand lens. So it's very, very tiny. But then once you look at it under a microscope, it's just so intricate. So it's a great example of how the closer you look, the more you see. So I just really, really quickly, I know I'm getting towards the end of the talk. So I'm just going to do a really brief overview of some resources to get you started on bryo hunting and ID. Hopefully, over the course of this presentation, I have, hopefully you've sort of gotten it. Hopefully I've managed to convince you that bryophytes are as cool as I think they are, and got you a little bit more curious about wanting to look at them a little bit closer. And so I'll just give you a couple resources of how to get you started on that. Unfortunately, one of the hardest things, and one of the reasons why bryophytes, you know, aren't as accessible of a group of organisms to get into as other things, is because magnification is key. These are tiny, tiny plants. So a hand lens is absolutely essential if you're going to start looking at them. A magnifying glass is okay. I would suggest, though, if you do want to start looking at these more and you don't have a magnifying glass or a hand lens, I would definitely invest in something with a higher magnification than a magnifying glass. If you have a magnifying glass already, then go ahead and try it. But I wouldn't go out and buy a magnifying glass just because it's easier. I would definitely pay a little bit more to get a little bit higher magnification. And so a standard Botanist hand lens is a great way to get started on that. If you don't want to get a hand lens, that's okay. Thankfully, we're living in times where it's a little bit easier to access magnification tools. So here's two other examples of things that aren't botanist, aren't typical hand lenses that are still really useful. This is a jeweler's loupe. So that's some geology stores, for example, might sell those. And that is perfectly acceptable. There's also, I have this little clip that clips onto my phone. It clips over the camera of the phone, and it basically acts as a little tiny microscope that you then hold your phone up to anything that you want to look at, and it'll magnify it. Yeah, it's a 30 times zoom, and most hand lenses only go up to about 20. So it does get a little bit closer. And that one, that was a gift, but if I recall correctly, it was under $20. So things like that can be fairly accessible to get started. And then, of course, beginner-friendly guides. There aren't a ton, but there are some. And thankfully, there's this third one here actually came out a few years ago and is quite nice. So there's a couple different options. Which one you choose depends a lot on what you're hoping to get out of the experience. So for example, this one includes mosses, liverworts, and hornworts, whereas the other two only include mosses. I will say none of them include all the species that you'll ever have a chance to find in your area, because again, 680 species is a lot of species. So most sort of accessible guides, unless you have your 3-volume set of manuals, you're not going to be able to find everything that you could possibly see. But these are great ways to get started, and they do sort of give you an idea of like what species might look similar to the other ones and all those sorts of things. And this one, especially the mosses of the northern forest, has amazing, excellent photos and pictograms to give you an idea of how to group species, how to look at them, what things you might need to look at them. So if anyone has any questions about which one to go with based on what needs they have, I'm happy to talk about that with them. There's also resources on the web to get you started. I just realized I didn't mention the most obvious one. The most obvious one is the Flora of North America bryophyte flora. So if you look up bryophyte flora of North America, they have a really fantastic website that has really comprehensive keys. It may be hard to get started though, because going through the keys can be really, really difficult because there's a lot of really specialized terminology that if you're not used to might be really hard to navigate. But if you just want to look at, like if you want to get started looking at photos, for example, the Bryologist Association of Quebec has a website called Prioquel, par la Société Québécoise de Bryologie, and they have a really good list of all the species that are in Quebec, as well as photos and range maps for all of them. Well, not photos for all of them, but range maps for all of them. And the Ohio Moss and Lichen Association also has Common Ohio Mosses page. And then the British Bryological Society also has a really good website. These two are for the English ones. Prioquel, unfortunately, is mostly in French. And there are also some other really good websites in Europe, but I think most of them you have to translate, use like Google's tool to translate the websites. Like for example, Switzerland has a really good one, but it's in German and French. The other thing that you could use as a resource is people, because if you happen to know a bryo enthusiast in your area, definitely reach out to them, because we don't bite and we love talking about these things, and it is a difficult field to get into. There's a lot of very specialized terminology that if you don't get another person's interpretation of what those things mean, it can be really hard to sort of see it in your head. That in person to person, face to face, sort of break it down for me kind of approach can be really, really useful. That's what I've seen be the most effective in my experience. Of course, that's not always an easy thing. A lot of people, you're looking at me going, but of course, Cassandra, if I knew a bunch of bryo enthusiasts, I wouldn't be going to this talk, because I would just be asking them questions about bryophytes instead of coming to this talk, which is fair and very, very valid. So I would say, just very, very briefly, I would say one great way to maybe start figuring out who is a bryo enthusiast in your area and what kind of things they do. And maybe see if you can get sort of recruit people to identify your observations. iNaturalist is a great way to do that. And for those of you who don't know iNaturalist, it's a website, an application where you can take a photo of something that you see, upload your observation onto iNaturalist, and then other naturalists can see that observation, they can search for it, and they can identify it. So, and it'll also give you suggestions. The app itself will give you suggestions on what what it probably is based on its image recognition algorithm, which it actually surprisingly is not bad for bryophytes, because there are a lot of people sort of working to contribute their identifications to make that algorithm better. So that's one way that you can get to know, sort of if you start uploading bryophyte observations, who's looking at them, who's commenting on them, who is identifying them. That could be a way to get to know people that might be able to help you with what you're seeing. And with that, I think I'm done for now. So I will direct it over to questions. But like I said, if there are things that are sort of on people's minds, I just want to make sure I'm getting to questions first. If there's tons of questions, then we'll just field all the questions. If there aren't a ton of questions, I do have some other supplemental slides that I can go over if people are sort of just like interested in me covering other things, but that might come up in some of the questions as well. So I'll open it to questions now, and go from there. Thanks.
All right, that was great. Thank you. So we do have quite a few questions. And I go back and start at the top. This is from Dennis. Do bryophytes hybridize with each other, with each group, or do the reproductive systems not allow for that?
So I'm going to say my short answer is we really don't know enough about them to know how much they do that with hybridizing with each other. I've heard that there are some groups of species, of closely related species, that do hybridize, but even just the basic taxonomy of bryophytes is so understudied that it's quite likely that any answer that I give is not reflective of the reality, that it's possible that they do it a lot more than we think they do. But in general, it does seem like it's less well known to happen than in other groups.
All right. I don't know if you have the answer for this, because I think you said you got some photos from your mentor. What type of camera did you use for all the close-up photos? They are amazing.
I am admittedly a terrible photographer. So most of the photos are a combination of, actually, so I can give a couple of tips. So some of the ones, so for example, the one of the rustwort that was taken with a hand lens, what I do to get close up in the field is I take I'll either take my hand lens and I'll put it over, like just put it right in front of the lens of my camera, and then just hold it over whatever I'm trying to take a picture of. And that, it's tricky because you do have to hold it still, and that is a little bit of a pain in the butt. But if you can get it to hold still, that can get you a significant amount of magnification. Some of the really nice photos, Jennifer took a lot of them. She has a TGI Tough, I think, that took them, I think that's an Olympus. A camera, if you are looking for, like, you know, if I wanted to buy a point and shoot, what should I look for? One that does photo stacking, like one that does focus stacking. So like it has an option for you to take multiple photos in a range of focuses at once. That will give you a much, because they're so small, and you're using a macro lens or a macro setting, at least most of the time. The focal depth is not very deep, so chances are pretty good that you're only going to get one little bit of the plant in focus if you don't have that stacking. So that's really handy. And I think so another person that's contributed photos to this talk that are particularly good just has a really good iPhone. So those are my tips on how to get stuff like that. But some of the photos were also taken under a microscope, some of the really small ones.
You know, your cell cameras right now are just phenomenal for up close macro. I mean, I have a big, huge lens for birds, and I'm not very good at cameras, but I use that for the far away stuff, and then I just use my Samsung for up close. So at minimum, you can do that, and it still gets some pretty cool pictures, I think. Not the microscope ones, but all right. So the next one's from Kat. Over what distance will the sperm travel to reach a female moss of the same species, and over what substrate?
I think it depends a lot on the species, but it tends to not be very far. So, you know, when you think about how far can it travel with water, it probably depends a lot on the what's the word? The flow regime of the area, because even if you're dealing with like areas that have a lot of water, you're not necessarily in an area that has where the water will flow very far, especially if it's surrounded by in a moss colony where it's all getting soaked up. So all that to say, it's kind of shocking that sexual reproduction even happens at all. But you can understand, you can sort of start to see that like it tends to only happen within very, very close colonies. And then that dispersal, you kind of hope gets them a little bit farther away. But yeah, in general, it doesn't go very far. And it may be for that reason that not every species of bryophyte actually reproduces sexually. A lot of them just reproduce by vegetative reproduction, because in some cases it's just more effective. It can get them farther. It's a safer bet. So there are a lot of species that actually are not known to reproduce, to create capsules very often.
Another question from Kat. Can certain species, or are certain species used in water treatment systems or in rehabilitating polluted sites?
That's a great question. I don't know. I'm sure they are. I don't know a concrete answer to that. I don't know of like specific projects that do use them. If anybody does, please feel free to comment in the chat, because I could see it being a really useful strategy. It is possible. Like peat moss is one of those mosses that is one of the few mosses that actually does get used on an industrial scale and harvested on an industrial scale. So if it does happen, I could see it being peat that is used.
I think there's septic systems that are using peat mosses now.
Yeah.
Or kind of microsite level, but yeah, it's obviously got applications. Oh, someone answered in the chat. I just missed it. Oh. Researchers in Japan have demonstrated that moss can be a green alternative for decontaminating polluted water and soil. Their study shows that, in particular, the moss Phaneria hygrometrica tolerates and absorbs an impressive amount of lead, I think. I'm just trying to scroll down without losing it on my little screen. Yeah, from the water. So yeah.
Okay, and that's the bonfire moss that I had shown pictures of.
Yeah, nature's got all kinds of solutions. We just gotta pay attention to them, right?
Yep, exactly.
Catherine's asked, is it possible to buy bryophytes for one's garden responsibly and not have to dig them out of the forest? I think there was some chatter in the chat about it as well, but.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Is it possible to buy bryophytes, buy bryophytes, that's a tongue twister, for one's garden responsibly so you don't have to dig them out of the forest? Okay. I
know that there is a company in the States that does that and grows it responsibly for that purpose. I'm not sure about it's the only one I know of, so I suspect that may be the exception that proves the rule, that it may be hard to come by. Yeah, it's tricky because like bryophyte poaching is actually a thing, and you know, you see like Instagram posts of moss terraria and sort of moss art, because it can also be dehydrated and used in crafts, and so it is one of many situations where there's that risk of sort of people going out into the forest and not understanding how long it can take for those colonies to grow back, and how quickly it can be harvested relative to the amount of time it takes to grow back. So it is something that you need to be careful of.
Right, so Anna's asked a similar question about cleaning up toxic spills, so I think we've answered that. Anna, if not, let me know. And then Byron do you have a favorite field guide for the region? I don't know, you discussed that live, right?
Oh, do I have a favorite field guide for the region? Okay, so this is the thing. There are no guides. There are no guides for any for Ontario specifically. Most of the guides that exist for this that cover this area are like all the guides that you saw there are for oh, sorry, 1 second. It says I've been signed out, but I hope that's not true.
Oh, you're still there. We can still see you.
Perfect. I'm just gonna ignore that. So all the guides that I showed are for northeastern North America. And the reason for that is partly because there are just not a lot of guides for bryophytes. So what we have is what we have, but also the other reason for that is because there is a lot of overlap in the bryophyte flora from anything east of the prairies and west of the Maritimes and north of like Southeast US. Has a very I don't want to say it's not homogeneous at all. It is diverse, but the species that you can cover in one guide tends to cover, or if for one region tends to cover most of the common species for the other region. So that's why there's no very regional specific guide. It's mostly just for northeastern North America, and all three of those guides, I think any guide that you can find that's for beginners covers those areas.
Great. Byron also asked, are there invasive mosses?
There are some. Again, it's one of those things that's really understudied, so we don't fully understand it, but there are some that are introduced from say if you buy soil that comes from Europe, then there are some moss species that are these like ephemeral little things that pop up on disturbed soil, and they can come from overseas. For example, I don't know of any that are so invasive that they have been causing a ton of problems, but I know that they do exist.
Okay. And the flip, I guess, to that is, are mosses looked at as being endangered, and how will we know?
Yeah, there are quite a few. There's a few that are listed by SARA and COSARO as well. So there are some that are legally at risk because they are both rare and that are growing in areas that are threatened. But a lot of it is true. Like, how would we know is actually a great question, because a lot of what we have to go on in terms of conservation status is purely because of rarity, because rarity is the only information that we have to go on. So it is tricky trying to categorize and prioritize and rank conservation status for bryophytes, because for a lot of species, there's not a lot of information.
Great. The next one's from Bruce. Mosses don't seem to be bothered, excuse me, or eaten by insects. Do they have some natural defenses? They tend to not have a ton of nutritional value in the actual vegetative part. There are some insects that are actually specifically adapted to feed on them. One thing that does happen a lot is they get chewed on by slugs. Slugs love capsules. They love the capsules. They'll chew up the capsules pretty fast. For the most part, it's mostly just that the vegetative material is not easily digestible and is not particularly nutritious. So I think that tends to be why in general. Okay. Oops, I think I skipped over one. This is from Natasha. Hi, Natasha. Is bryomonitoring.ca a good place to start too?
Bryomonitoring.ca. I am not familiar with it, but I cannot comment. It could be a very good one.
I think we're all going to look it up when we're done.
Yeah.
All right. Byron's asking, do capsules emerge at a certain time of year?
That's actually a great question. So seasonality varies from species to species, and that's actually another thing that, like, we had a volunteer that was really curious about that question at the herbarium and was looking into it a lot, and we didn't have a lot to tell them because we see patterns, but those patterns have not been very well described, generally speaking. So it's one of those things that's still, like, there's no one spot where you could look it up and find out when these things come out. But it does depend on the species. It also depends on the environmental conditions. And sometimes it's hard to find a pattern. But in general, like, for example, I've seen the thyme mosses tend to come up in almost as soon as possible in the spring. And then other ones I've seen come up towards the fall. So it does differ. Definitely, I would say I haven't seen any that come out in winter. Like, they generally are just trying to, the things that actually are out, we're just trying to get through the winter. But across the sort of active season, it tends to be across the board, but differing from species to species. And I will say though, there is a season, like once one part of the family starts popping up capsules, often the whole thing goes. So it will tend to go all at once.
We can relate with the bosses just trying to get through the winter. It's a question from Trudy. Are mosses thought to be derived from liverworts, or is there any evidence that one came before the other? Also, what would you say are the few most determining characteristics between the two?
That first question is actually one that's still up in the air. Like, it's gone back and forth a ton of times. Like, every time they do a new sort of molecular phylogeny, every time they do, like, we are the working group on moss taxonomy, and we have decided this is the evolutionary history, and it seems to change frequently. It's constantly evolving. I think we used to think liverworts were the least derived and mosses were the most derived, and that hornworts were somewhere in the middle, and I think it's changed since then. So the reason why I don't have a very good answer is because it seems to change every time I look it up. And what was the second question? Can you repeat that?
Oh, I just answered it. It was, what are the most defining characteristics between the two?
Oh, between the three different groups. So the mosses tend to set themselves apart by having more of a three-dimensional structure to their shoot. So when you see the leaves tend to come out from all directions, and these are all general statements. There's always an exception to the general rule. There's, as I've probably shown, a couple of exceptions in those common species. In general, mosses tend to have leaves that stick out from all planes, and a capsule that's quite hardy and sort of like woody looking, of different colors, and a more sophisticated capsule, you know, like it has more differentiation of parts to it. And mosses will tend to, in general, be bigger. Liverworts, so leafy liverworts can be differentiated from mosses in that leafy liverworts do tend to be more flat to the ground in two planes, like, or sorry, in one plane. So their leaves are sort of out in pairs, and not really stacked around on top of each other. And the liverworts are also much more delicate. The leafy liverworts are like mosses. You can usually get maybe 2 cells thick, the leaves, 1 or 2 cells thick, but liverworts, like, just the leaves are 1 cell thick, that's it. They're teeny tiny things. Thalloid liverworts, you can tell from those two because they're just sort of like these rubbery lobes that are growing right along, like in these kind of continuous smooth patches. And hornworts look similar to those in that they're kind of these little lobes of rubbery material. But unlike phthalate liverworts that put up little sort of like mushroom looking stalks, or little the little translucent stalk that I showed with the little black ball on top, they have these long green horns that come up as their sporophyte. I can just I'll show a picture just because I know I went over them really quickly when I was first talking about them. So just putting that in your head. So that's just to visualize what I was just describing.
And Ernie says liverworts look like succulents.
They kind of do, yeah. They have the phthalate liverworts are very fleshy, and their leaves, the thallus is a lot thicker than other bryophytes. Those will often, especially the complex phthalate liverworts, they'll often be several cells thick.
All right. Okay, this is, I often see lichens and bryophytes in close proximity. Do they compete with each other?
That's a good question. They can. There's no, I haven't heard of any specific trend one way or the other. It's one of the things I actually looked at in my honors thesis, because I was looking at a lichen species that was of conservation interest, and we were looking at whether the mosses that were growing around it on tree bases actually competed with it or not. And it tended to be a pretty even split. Like sometimes the moss would be overgrowing the lichen, sometimes the lichen would be overgrowing the moss. And, you kind of ask yourself, does that, what does that really mean? I've seen some lichens that do tend to outcompete mosses on rocks. When I see them, the cover is very clear that the lichen has just overgrown the moss. But there's no, I don't know of any what trend one way or the other. Yeah.
A future thesis for somebody, maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Is it known what determines whether a plant becomes male or female? Are the genetics of sexual determination known?
That's an amazing question. I once looked it up because I was afraid someone was going to ask me that question, because I realized I had no idea. And apparently it's actually incredibly, like, we just don't know. And apparently it's just downright fascinating. Like sometimes it can change. Oh goodness. See, of course, it's a while since I read it, because I read it the last time I was doing something like this. And now I can't remember, but there are some, they don't even have, different mosses have different, just like fundamental ways that chromosomes work. Like within different species of moss, like the genetics are fundamentally different. And apparently in some groups that have one kind of way that the chromosomes work, sexual determination happens one way, and then in another one, it happens a different way. So the long and short of it is it's a lot more complex, I think, than we give it credit for.
This is a smart group. These questions are amazing.
Yeah.
So we've just got a few more. Are liverworts and hornworts more closely related to each other compared to mosses, or are they all equally related to each other, basically? As far as I know, the understanding at the moment is that, because that's very similar to the other question about which one came first. As far as I know, at the moment, it's understood that hornworts are as distinct as the other groups. Yeah. So they're not any more closely related to liverworts than they are to bryophytes. In fact, I think for the last I'd heard, the hornworts were more distinct than mosses were to liverworts. So yeah, they are evolutionarily distinct. Like this is leading to some bad battle of the bryophytes.
Yeah, and I should also mention too that actually it's not even a done deal that leafy liverworts are more closely related to phthalate liverworts than other bryophytes, so which I find fascinating. Yeah.
Great. Samantha wants to know, is there any way to stay informed about other bryophyte related workshops or webinars?
In Ontario, it's tricky because we don't have a bryological society. There's no group that handles that. So I would imagine, so I just finally joined the Field Botanist of Ontario. It's been a long time coming. Sorry to everyone who's a member then. But the Field Botanists of Ontario do have bryophyte walks. So do individual naturalist groups. So they sometimes have stuff on. If you are comfortable in French and you find you will ever get to Quebec, the Quebec Bryological Society is some of the nicest people I have ever met and some of the most like welcoming and friendly. So you know, for anyone to whom that is accessible, I would certainly recommend it. But yeah, the field botanists do occasionally have things. And if you want to reach out to the National Herbarium, the curator Jennifer, who was my mentor, she's an absolute whiz. Yeah, at the moment, that's all I can really think about because we don't really have, there's no organized group in Ontario.
Sounds like that's something for you to do in all your spare time.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, the last question, which I find very interesting as an allergy sufferer, I'm allergic to everything good in life, wine, cheese, horses, outdoors, you name it. It's so interesting that all the species of this group, oh, wait, no, I'm reading the wrong one, sorry. Do you know of any research on bryophyte spores as airborne allergens? Stands to reason that if pollen can be inducing sinus allergies, then so could smaller spores.
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is I do not know, but it does stand to reason that would be a possibility.
I'm gonna hope not. There's enough floating around.
Yeah.
All right, so that was great. There was hopefully I cut anything from the chat. There was a lot of chat going on, some amazing questions. Fascinating webinar. Thank you so much, Cassandra. It is recorded because I think there was a few technical issues with people logging in. So we do post it and share it with everybody who registered because Zoom is suddenly getting really glitchy with people logging in. So again, thank you from everyone. We have people from the States, from BC, I think from all over. So very good talk. Obviously, there's a lot of great interest out there. So thank you for coming out tonight. And thank you for doing everything you do to help enlighten people about the wonderful natural world on a micro level, because clearly there's a lot more to discover and learn so that we can continue to value the natural world and hopefully lessen our impact on it.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, if at the end of the day I've got one person to start looking more carefully at the stuff growing on rocks, I'm happy.
Well, definitely one. I think you have a lot more than that. So congratulations. I'll join the Ontario Bryophyte Society when you get it going. Okay.
Excellent. Excellent.
Awesome.
I'll recruit my disciples.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, and I hope you have a fantastic night. Bye-bye.